Okay, here we go. Finally. So now we've gotten to the point, a very dire precipice here. So there's a distinction between theories, though, in this way, in central axioms. Not all central axioms are equal from a logical standpoint. So if we assert that logic is worth more than things that are not logical, then we can say a theory that is more integrated, that can explain more stuff, is more fundamental than a theory that explains less stuff. Such that if I come up with a theory about why I chose to say the word word right now, that's a hell of a lot more specific than and is nested within a larger theory, because it must be integrated into something that's bigger than it is. So, and again, that's assuming relativity. That's assuming that we want to use logic, because without that, then there isn't logic. And then by the time that we go beneath that even, then we realize, yes, they are all equal. All the central axioms are indeed equal. If I were to come up with a theory about why I said the word word back then, albeit more specific, it would be integrated within a larger theory. And so then I could say that its origin is ultimately the same origin from an absolutist standpoint as whatever theory it's nested within, because its specific origin is going to be dependent on the terminus of some other part integral of this theory. And then that integral or that other part would have its own origin, et cetera, all the way back to the original origin inside of the grand theory that all those other parts, those integrals, are all nested within. So, and that's justified by the law of hypothetical syllogism. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. So, when I start the theory with time versus space, one of those is more integrated and therefore more fundamental if we assert that logic is valuable, that logic is fundamental. If we assert that first, then, so what we're saying is, from the central axiom of the assertion that there is logic, that there is a two-reference system, that there is the field of relativity, by first asserting that that is there, then we say that any theory that is more integrated than another is also more fundamental and therefore must contain the smaller theory as an integral of the larger theory, meaning that the larger theory is more accurate in explaining the causes of the effects described and predicted and explained by that theory. So if I were to just to demonstrate this, before I get into time and space and all that stuff and proving which one is more fundamental than the other, let's look at something a little simpler, just to prove this point first, and then I'll move on. So if we were materialists and let's say empiricists, where everything that we say that exists physically, and that the physical world is the limit of existence. If we say that, then we can't explain consciousness, and we can't explain subjectivity, and we can't explain art, and we can't explain beauty or music. What we can explain are physical things and things that depend upon physical things. What we can't explain is everything else. And so then we know that consciousness creates empiricism, or causes, excuse me, not creates, only God creates. Consciousness causes empirical manifestations. And we know this because we demonstrate it every moment, because our bodies are moving and changing, which are physical objects. Our bodies are physical objects, and they are changing because of consciousness. And so we demonstrate that every moment of every day as humans. Now, if consciousness creates physical stuff, how does it do that? How does the mind tell the body what to do? Well, the mind finds methods, logical or relative methods, of transforming the soul's intent to the body's manifested action. So what it does is it increases the probability. This is how actualizations occurs. You get a multiplicity of possibilities, all of which aggregate, average, or converge, or agree, or amalgamate into one totality. That one totality then manifests, and that's the actualization or manifestation or realization of relativity, a mental concept, into physical reality of bodily action. So all our minds are doing is making it more probable that a certain event materializes. And the reason that we say more probable is and not certain is because the entire physical world is made up of quanta. So quanta exist in a state of uncertainty because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and because of the nature of zero-point energy, which is derived from the nature of I, indiscernibility, which is in turn derived from its distinct independence from being and nothing. I got so deep I forgot what I was talking about. The way that our minds, right now I remember. So everything exists in a state of probability, not certainty, because you can't be certain when you're dealing with I. When you're dealing with indiscernibility, you can't be certain. And that's exactly what Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is stating. It's stating that you can't be certain of something, of a quanta's physical position and momentum simultaneously. So why does that change when you get to classical physics? Because of aggregation. And that's the same process by which something actualizes. It aggregates. And it's the same reason that we consider quanta to have superpositioning, where there's a multiplicity of different trajectories, all of which exist at the same time. All those microstates exist at the same time, but they don't physically manifest unless they stack on top of each other. They have to be compressed, see? And then when they get compressed into a totality and they integrate, that's when they manifest, because they've all become one thing. And so then that one thing, the manifestation of that one thing, is in the integration of it, in all of the parts fitting together perfectly and all complementing each other perfectly as one whole system with no gaps, no broken parts, no weird vestigial tails that don't need to be there, just the raw components that make it work. So basically, manifestation happens in a similar way to starting your car. Everything starts inert, it's all there, it's just that there's nothing that's causing the whole system to all work together. All the parts are there, but they're just statically sitting there. They're not working, they're not doing anything. But once you start the car, they all start working together. All the functions of all the parts mix together. And they don't contradict each other. They're all working in one pattern. So that when the gasoline is flowing through the engine, it doesn't suddenly stop and then magically transport somewhere else in the car. It goes in a single integrated contiguous fluid line from A to B. And it does so in a very predictable way. And that allows the entire car as one unit, all those parts to work together. In the same way, when possibilities all agree, then something can actualize, realize, and become certain. Because if everything agrees and there is not anything that disagrees, then it will just happen. Then that's obviously what, happens. And it's the same way that we use logic is, well, if A, then B. So given A, then we must conclude B. It's the same kind of thing. It's like all the premises working together gives you a logically valid conclusion. All those conclusions combined together logically into one unit, then have not a conclusion, because you've got a whole bunch of conclusions. You derive a fact from all those conclusions. You derive a formal, or I don't know what exactly the word is, objective state from all those conclusions. So in other words, what I'm saying is, each of these dimensions from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, because things empirically manifest in the third dimension. In the second dimension, they are integrated. Okay, so I have to correct myself. I don't think that the manifestation happens exactly at the integration part. It happens right after that. So as soon as it has already integrated, that integrated 2D form, that pure Platonic form, that idealized form, that abstract possible state, having integrated and become 100% certain, where every single part in it is known, and or at least knowable, every single part in it is knowable. It means that if you were to take any local part of that system and you knew the relations that it had, you would then be able to derive the state of every other part in that system, excluding none. 100% certainty. When that happens, it's integrated. After that happens, it starts to manifest into physical space. And what space is it's just another combination of all those 2D Platonic forms compressed and conjoined into one total system. And that total system being composed of two-dimensional Platonic forms becomes three-dimensional empirical space. And that's what the materialists use to derive everything else. And that's why they can't explain the second dimension or the first dimension or the zeroth dimension. They just take the empirical world as given, and all that is it's a truncated version of, I guess you would call it panpsychism, or at the very least, logicism. The idea that logic is the most fundamental. And that, in turn, is a truncation of art, which assumes that the subject is the most fundamental. This is really what the postmodernists are getting at when they get at the modernists and the realists and the empiricists is, you can't prove this to me. You can't prove that there is such a thing as substance. I can talk of everything in existence. I can visualize and experience everything in existence without there being such a thing as physical substratum. I don't need my body to feel an emotion. I don't need my eyeballs to see what you're saying. I don't need any of these physical vestigial forms, is what the postmodernists are saying. What they're critiquing is the less integrated, less fundamental, necessarily derived theories that don't explain everything, that aren't so integrated so as to be the truth as they present themselves to be. And in reality, what these empirical theories, these material theories are are just, like I had said, those smaller theories that are necessarily nested within larger theories, because they can't ever explain to you how the mind tells the body what to do. All they can tell you is after it does so, this is what you'll see. So that's all they're doing, is they're just picking up the story where the panpsychists and the other people that do believe in consciousness have left off. And that's how you know that consciousness is more fundamental than physics, because your mind tells your body what to do. Your body doesn't necessarily tell your mind what to think. Your mind is free and independent of your body to think whatever it wants about the sensory data that it receives. It can choose to ignore it. That's what happens when you daydream. You're not even seeing what's in front of you. I do this all day long. There are moments where I'm walking to work and I don't see the trees in front of me. I don't think about what my body's doing when it's walking around. The body just does it automatically, and I don't think about doing it. But the body can never do that to my mind. Now, it can be in extreme pain, for example, and then my mind has a lot more limits about what it can think about, because it could be shocking. But that doesn't tell me how to contextualize what that pain means. Is that pain something that I'm going to feel mental anguish about, or mental apathy, or mental joy at? Because I could experience excruciating physical pain, but yet my mind is free to interpret that however it wishes. It's not necessary that the mind thinks that that's a bad thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't have masochists. And there wouldn't be people that cut off their own body parts or something like that. Voluntarily, just removing their own body parts. There's people that do that. Why? Because the mind tells the body what to do. The body doesn't necessarily tell the mind what to do. The mind can listen to what the body's saying, but it can also ignore it. Or it can twist its words into some other kind of a meaning. So, time is less fundamental than space. You have to have space before you have time, because time requires change. If there is no change, there is no time. But space doesn't require change. You don't have to have change in order to have space, because you can have a space of inert, frozen, static, whatever, and that's perfectly fine. It's basically what the world looks like when you take a snapshot of it. If you were to take a photograph of the world, it's this static object, right? But we experience it as if it were moving and fluid. But the photograph tells us that it's static and not changing. So the photograph is more fundamental and can explain more stuff than the movie reel, because the movie reel is composed of those photographs, those snapshots. In order to compile a movie, you have to first have a bunch of individual photographs. So that's how the dimensions are built. It's like going from a photograph, a lower dimension, to a movie, a higher dimension. The higher dimensions are not better, they're less fundamental. They're more advanced, but they're less fundamental. So it means that they're more specific, they have higher resolution, but yet they're more truncated, and they're further from the origin than the grander or lower dimensions. The lowest dimension that there is zero, the zeroth dimension. The zeroth dimension is subjective and artistic, and it has to deal with our subconsciousness, what I usually call the soul. But you don't have to be mystical. You don't have to call it the soul if you don't want to. It's what's beneath your consciousness that builds your consciousness, because there is no such thing as something that just pops into being already made. Everything is made from subcomponents before it. Even the mind is made up of subcomponents that then, independently exist of each other in order to compile together, integrate, and form into one whole unit, which is the mind. So the reason that we get intuitions in our mind where we can't explain where they came from, we can't explain why we feel like something is the case or not, but there's this subjective thing of ringing true. And I think that is, I call it subjective resonance. There's a resonance when subjective states all integrate and become certain. And that's the resonance. And as opposed to some noise, some pattering, some smattering, some mishmash of this, whatever this is. This doesn't flow. This isn't a thing. It's not even really distinguishable. It's sort of like amorphous, almost random, I guess, as opposed, like I said, back to that resonance, which is very distinct, very certain, very exact, very precise, focused, as opposed to diffuse, random, and I don't know what it is, sort of a thing, where you don't really have a whole lot of resonance. So that, I think, is the bridge in between what happens at the subjective, subconscious scale that then combines and integrates into the final product in the mind, a thought. And then those mental thoughts all integrate until they become certain about exactly what they want done. And then the body reacts, and that's the action the body finally ends up taking. But it originates in the soul, or the subconscious, the zeroth dimension. And then you could ask, okay, but where does that come from? And that's that, depending on how you ask that question, or depending on how you want to answer that question, is going to determine whether you're talking about a logical theory who knows its limits, does not say anything about that kind of thing, or if you're talking about religion and dogma. So, like I had said, anything beneath the first dimension is so fundamental that it becomes impossible to logically verify. You can't tell me exactly, what it is at the zeroth dimension. You can't tell me exactly, precisely, what a subjective state is. I can never tell you in words what happiness feels like. I can only relate it to other emotions. If you've never felt an emotion, it's all just a bunch of vestigial phrases and words. It doesn't mean anything because it goes nowhere. It has no root. It's just a pitter-patter of nonsense. It doesn't have any rhythm. It doesn't have anything. It's just random noise. It doesn't make any sense. So there's a limit to logic, and it can't penetrate into subjectivity. I can't make subjectivity make sense logically. I can't derive logic from it. But what I can do is I can show what a distorted image of that would be, but I can't tell you where the distortion actually is. I can tell you that this is a blurry photograph, but I can't tell you what the unblurred image actually looks like. I can't uncover it. But I can show you at least the blurry image. And the blurry image is what I had described earlier as far as intuition. So the way that the thought appears into the mind is unknown and unknowable, but I believe the way that it happens is the same way that the mind does everything with the body. It's just one step below it. In which case, it's a whole bunch of these micro subjects, each of which is correspondent to some drive, some intent. It wants something, and they all compete with each other, and they aggregate into this finalized superposition, which is just an aggregation or an average of all those drives. Or it might just be the biggest one, the one that has the largest force behind it. Or it could be the one that has the biggest mass, that is the largest integrated thing, that best represents the total self, that is most in line with what that self usually would do. And so then we end up with normal behavior and normal feelings and normal states of being. And so then we think of us as having a self because of that normalization of tendency for the micro subjects, those drives, those Jungian archetypes, or id drives that are all competing, the one that wins is the one that is the most normal, because it's the one that has the greatest probability of being manifested. It's the least resistant one. It's the one that's least resisted because it's the largest. It's the most integrated, the most consistent, the most frequent. That's why if you just keep repeating the same request over and over and over and the person can't escape it, eventually they will comply. There is a limit where just simply repeating the same request, you don't have to do anything other than that, just simply repeating the same request over and over and over again, it will force the person to comply with it. This is how advertisements work. If they just keep saying it, you will eventually buy it. No one thinks about buying it. It just happens because it's like if I were to dig out a groove in your floor, every time you dump water, it's going to go along that groove. I don't make you dump the water. I don't put the water there. That's you. That's just something that happens because of your normal life. But if I put that groove in your floor, it's going to force the water to flow down it. And that's what happens with advertisements. And that's why they pay for them. And they do work. And it works on everyone. And it doesn't matter if you're smart or stupid or paying attention. It doesn't matter. It's just the presence of that sensory information. It will be processed by your mind. And that will therefore then cause your mind to think about it in at least a subconscious way. If it does it long enough, eventually it will just do that by default and it'll become an instinct and the mind will just go there. When you go to the store, that's when the advertisement goes to work because it's been compiling and compiling and compiling. And then when you go to the store, your eyes are saturated with all kinds of random information. But there's that one brand that you saw on the TV a million times yesterday. And so then it's the one that pops out at you. It's the one that's the first one seen. And since you don't want to think about it, you just grab it. And that choice was made by the advertisement company. That is how advertisements work. So it is then possible for me to explain that if I'm using the subconscious as if it were conscious. Now, I like to think that the reason that works like that is because it's just a truncated part of a grander field where, yeah, it's true, but there's a whole lot more where that came from. There's so much that's missed that doesn't make it into that, you know, we can't put into words, that we can't put into a theory, that we can't rationalize. But we can rationalize that part. And that's because there has to be some logic in your subject. Otherwise, nothing would make sense to you. Because eventually it's got to go into a root, into your soul somewhere. Your soul must then use, at least in part, some logic. So your soul does have logic in it. That's how you can have an intuition. So it's sort of like if you were to throw a whole bunch of examples at an AI and you say, give me the rule, extract the rule from all these examples such that if I were to show you a novel example of all those things, would you then be able to use that extracted rule to predict that it is a member of all the rest of those or not? And if the AI can succeed in doing that, then you've successfully trained the AI to discern or recognize something. And yet you would say it has no soul, it has no mind, it has no ability to think, but it's clearly identifying something. So how is that possible for it to identify something if it isn't conscious, if it doesn't have some soul to it? And that's where my theory comes in, and it says it does have one. It's just smaller than ours. It's the same thing as our pets. They have souls. They're just not as big as ours are. They have emotions. They're just not as big as ours are. They're not as sophisticated. They're not as developed. but they're the same kind of creature. Everything is the same kind of creature. Everything is exactly the same. It's just either bigger or smaller over here or over there. That's it. And the rest of it is all just compounding that over and over and over. Everything is a person. And again, like I had said, it isn't logical to do this. It isn't logically justifiable to say that everything is a person. But I do, because like I said, it is so integrated. It seems to be able to predict things that would otherwise be unpredictable. And that tells me that it's true. Because if I keep making predictions and I keep seeing those predictions come true in reality, then that tells me that I'm getting something right, that I'm on the right path. And so I think the most fundamental theory would be an artistic one that says that everything is a person and everything is part of an art piece. And so what is an art piece of which everyone is a person? A play. Or at least a performative art, like singing or dancing or theatrics, cinema, stuff like that. Those performative arts are the ones that would be the closest analogy to what existence is doing. That kind of a theory that says that and then derives everything from that would be the most fundamental theory. But that theory, I believe, should come from Christ. So I don't even want to go there. That shit's scary as fuck. But there should then be a theory of that, of art. And a theory of art would be the theory. Now, that still doesn't mean that that theory of art actually is everything. It just means that it's the largest, most integrated theory that explains the most stuff. But it still doesn't explain its own origin, as nothing can. So, that, I think, is where my theory is. It's not a theory of art, which even that isn't everything itself, isn't the real reality. So you've got the real reality, that's the most integrated, the most real, the most ineffable, right? The most fundamental. Then you've got the theory of art that explains everything after that. So it explains the theory of mind, which is what I'm discussing with Deus Ex Machina. That's a theory of relativity. It's a theory about the limits of relativity. And then there would be a theory of form, which would explain the Platonic ideals or holograms or abstract forms, from which we then get a theory of physical empirical manifestations, which would then be the physics version of the theory of art. And its job would just be to predict and explain objective physical states of objects. And then further, you'd have another theory about time, which would be how those objects change over time, because there's a difference between the physical properties of a system and how those physical properties change over time, because those are two totally different things. And then the theory after that theory of time would be a theory about choice, about different variant timelines. And then there'd be a theory about the limits of that, such that you could describe every possible choice that any given system could make. And that will tell you the limits that it has to choose from, where you could be certain about what it won't do, because it won't ever go past this limit. That would be a six-dimensional theory, etc. And so you'd have a theory for every dimension. And you can only have as many theories as there are dimensions, because dimensions are describing an integrated field of information. If you don't have that integrated field of information, then I can't transmit anything about that to you. Now, it might exist, but I wouldn't be able to know about it, and I wouldn't be able to tell you about it if I did know. So there's a limit to everything. And my theory is limited to relativity. And by the way, all those dimensions, all those integrated fields of information, all have to deal with their referent. They all have their own correspondent referent, which means there's always one more referent than there are dimensions. So even though there's the 0th dimension, there's one referent for that 0th dimension. And that one referent is the subject. It's art. Everything else is a derivation thereof.